Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here. Hope you're all doing well, and let's not waste any time and jump straight into continuing the Chaos Dwarf Q&A. Real quick before we do hop into it, I do want to note that I have noticed, and I've responded to a couple of them, but I have noticed there's actually been a couple things that people have been offering thoughts on, either minor corrections or things that I just flat out missed. And I did want to acknowledge those and say that at the end of the series, whatever the last episode ends up being, once I'm through all the scripted stuff, I will do another episode that will be purely dedicated to going back and looking at some of the things that I goofed on or missed something. For instance, I think it was the last episode or the one before, while we were discussing Chaos Dwarf technology, when we spoke about the Navy, it completely went off my radar to check Man of War, the old tabletop game, just because I am not familiar with Man of War. My experiences with Man of War were pretty much limited to the video game that was made about it, and then of course Dreadfleet, which is entirely different. So there's actually Chaos Dwarf vessels in that I totally missed on, which is my bad. And I just wanted to acknowledge that real quick and say that when I get to the end of the series, I will be going through the comment sections on a lot of the videos and checking for any mistakes that I may have made, and then making sure to find the sources on those mistakes and get them corrected, and then, we'll kind of have an episode dedicated to that at the end. In any event, let's get into today's questions. So we are continuing where we left off with, I guess you could say, design questions is kind of the name of this category. So the first one is, do you think / know if we will see Chaos Dwarfs in Game 3? How do I think they'll be implemented or added into Total War Warhammer? So I know for a fact that Chaos Dwarfs will be in Game 3. I do not know when they will be in Game 3. I personally feel very confident that the Chaos Dwarfs will probably be the first major DLC after Total War Warhammer 3 releases. It could be that they do something a little smaller to start, maybe like a Lord pack or some kind of new DLC, but I think the first campaign pack or race pack that they release after Total War Warhammer 3 comes out, so not the pre-order DLC, but something different, I think will be the Chaos Dwarfs. I think this will open up the Darklands for a big amount of experience in Game 3, and also will completely unveil the Plain of Zar on the Mortal Empire's map, which is a lot of the Darklands territory north of where the current Mortal Empire's map cuts off when you go into the east. I predict that the Chaos Dwarfs Empire will be, when Game 3 comes out, and maybe even when it's melded through Mortal Empires, because the Chaos Dwarfs might come after the melding of the Total War Warhammer games. If they have not been released yet, I do suspect that the Chaos Dwarf Empire is going to be hidden on the map by like a great wall of polluting smoke and ash, with maybe a few places like the Tower of Gorgoth, Uzkalak, and the Black Fortress being empty ruins, or maybe they'll be filled with standby factions like Greenskins, Skaven, or Ogre Kingdoms. This is basically what they kind of did with the Tomb Kings. If folks remember, during Game 2, there was a time where Nehekara, you could go into Nehekara, but there were different factions and ruins that were kind of there taking up space until the Tomb Kings got their full release. And I suspect something very similar is going to happen with the Chaos Dwarfs. Personally, I feel incredibly confident, just 100 billion% that Ogre Kingdoms are going to be the pre-order race. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see. But with that, the Chaos Dwarfs, are going to be later on. As for what they'll be like and how they're going to be implemented, I do think that the Chaos Dwarfs will get the full campaign pack treatment, which, for anyone curious, it's a stupid, nebulous thing, but there technically is a difference between a race pack and a campaign pack. Race packs were what we received during the entirety of Game 1's life cycle, which were for the Wood Elves, Beastmen, and Norska, and the Warriors of Chaos, which they were much smaller DLCs that came with 2 Legendary Lords and we're missing notable elements and entire chunks of their factions. Whereas campaign packs was something they introduced in Game 2, which replaced the race packs, as far as I can tell, because there hasn't been any new race packs since the end of Game 1. And Game 2, they gave us the Tomb Kings and the Vampire Coast as campaign packs, which had 4 legendary lords and basically complete rosters. You know, they have added in little things. You know, we got the Bone Giant as free LC, for example. But for the most part, you know, they were released as complete experiences. I do think that's what they're going to do with the Chaos Dwarfs. The campaign packs are wildly popular and significantly more popular than the race packs. I don't think they have any intention of returning to race packs. But to represent the various aspects of the race, I think the 4 legendary lords will start with. I think the top dog and kind of the de facto racial leader, so to speak, so the equivalent to like Thorgrim Grudgebringer or Karl Franz, and those guys will be Astragoth Ironhand, who is the oldest living sorcerer prophet in Mingolzar Nagrund, and I believe that's where he'll start. He'll get to have the capital of the Empire as his start location. He will come along with his incredibly badass steam-powered mecha suit that allows him to be a terror in melee combat alongside his powerful sorceries and perhaps some cool shooting attacks like a steam gun or rapid-firing pistols, kind of similar to Ikit Claw. I think hopefully his design philosophy will resolve around that he will specialize in Chaos Dwarf war machines, the Kadai, and other Demonsmith characters. But I do really hope they go ham with him having just the full mecha suit system, because that's what allows him to move around, is that so much of his body has turned to stone that he actually requires mechanical parts to move around, but of course has augmented himself significantly using that steam-powered suit. So I really hope they go absolutely wild with his design and make him really intimidating looking and just a powerhouse. Next up will be Draswath the Ashen, the Lord of the Black Fortress, who should start in the Black Fortress in the Southern Darklands as his start position. He will be another caster lord like Astragoth, but uniquely compared to all of the other lords, he will focus very heavily on being a mounted combatant and also having a monster, you know, being the monstrous lord essentially, because I think you should be able to upgrade him to either ride a Lamassu, a Great Taurus, and then at the top of the tree is his uniquely named Bale Taurus mount called Cinderbreath, which is, you know, the size of these. The Great Taurus and the Bale Taurus are on par with dragons when it comes to like hitting power, and they're colossal creatures. They're easily, you know, fighting in the ballpark of dragons, and can breathe fire and all this other crazy bullshit. Lamassus would come with cool bound spells and stuff like that. So I do think that he would make the best character for, you know, that second slot, because he would be your guy that revolves very heavily around monstrous creatures. So Draswath the Ashen would not only be your flying legendary lord, but I do think that for his personal design, he should come with lots of bonuses to Infernal Guard units and monstrous creatures. So any of the monsters that you can have available to you through the Chaos Dwarfs, you know, they would be very buff-centric with Draswath the Ashen. Next up, there is Shartor the Executioner, who we've spoken about in a previous video. I believe it would be best for him to step in as the Bull Centaur special character, and I would have him start somewhere far away, like very far away, to give a distinct and unique start position. Maybe have him on some kind of sacred pilgrimage in the name of Hashut. He should be a hardcore melee-focused character who specializes in being extremely tanky and just kicking ass with his spooky magic weapon, the Dark Tide Axe. For his faction design philosophy, Obviously, I think he should revolve entirely around Bull Centaurs, just have tons and tons of bonuses to Bull Centaur render units and the Bull Centaur Taruk heroes. So, you know, he gives them unique buffs and starting ranks and all that other stuff. Finally, if they really wanted to mix things up, the best character, I think, for the 4th Legendary Lord slot would be Gorda's Backstabber, an incredibly treacherous and bizarrely lucky Hobgoblin Chieftain who has managed to rise up high while avoiding the ire of his Chaos Dwarf masters. You could set him up literally anywhere in the world. Perhaps he has finally been ousted by his masters for growing too strong, and he seeks to become the next Hobgoblin Khan. So this would be your character that is the closest thing we would get to like a true Hobgoblin faction. Equipped with lighter weapons and armor, throwing knives, and you know, if you upgraded him to have a mount, he could have a giant wolf mount. I would say he should focus very heavily on being a very cheap and agile lord who is centered around skirmish warfare and has, you know, tons of bonuses to sneaking around and ambushing, and maybe he can maybe his campaign movement's way faster and he gives a speed buff to his entire army, and all of his faction bonuses and unique buffs should obviously be centered around all of the Hobgoblin units that make up the Chaos Dwarf roster. As for the roster itself, I would basically just take everything from the Tarmacon expansion and mix in anything missing to that book from the 5th edition Chaos Dwarf book, which basically, the only thing really missing from the Chaos Dwarf army book that should be added to Tarmacon, in my opinion, is just having basic Chaos Dwarf warriors. So, because in Tarmacon, your like lowest tier Chaos Dwarf warriors are not really that low tier. So getting lower tier Chaos Dwarf warriors to give you a little bit more numbers and some more options when you're picking weapons. Hobgoblin bolt throwers, I think, would be a nice thing to add in. And then, of course, giving us Chaos Dwarf lords as melee characters. That being said, if you're going to have a generic melee lord for the Chaos Dwarfs that can't cast magic, I do hope they spice up the name a little bit, besides just Lord. Maybe Overseer or Commander, something like that could be better. Just because if you have Dwarf Lords and then Chaos Dwarf Lords, I feel like that's too similar. You know, Chaos Dwarfs need spicier names. As for Legendary Heroes, because I do love talking about Legendary Heroes, I do think a Legendary Hero they could add in that could be available to everyone, all the Chaos Dwarf Legendary Lords, except for maybe Gorda's Backstabber. I would bring out Zatan the Black, a particularly nasty Chaos Dwarf known as the Commander of the Tower of Zar. Even among the pitiless Drathzar, Zatan is so wantonly cruel that it gives other Chaos Dwarves pause. Like, they're slightly uncomfortable with how cruel of an entity he is. He is one of the most successful lords in all of Mengolzar Nagrund, and he serves under the sorcerer prophet Gorth the Cruel, who is said to possess the most raw power in sorcery among the priesthood of Hashut. He's actually a notable rival to the likes of Astrogoth Ironhand. Hasn't managed to overwhelm him, but supposedly Gorth is just the flat out, when it comes to just raw magical power, he is the mightiest. But there are some other ways that Astrogoth manages to one-up him and stay in power, most notably age. Perhaps by a way to unlock Zatan that I think could be fun is maybe you get a quest or something where you have to impress or defeat Gorth the Cruel himself, and once this Master of the Lore of Hashut has been brought to heel, either because, you know, you have thoroughly impressed him or you've cut him down or whatever, you earn the employment of Zatan the Black, who would be an immensely skilled combatant in melee, very heavily armored, and a great commander to have leading your troops on the battlefield. Alright, next question. Why does Games Workshop call them dwarfs and not dwarves? Okay, so, honestly, I don't know. It may come down to copyright, where if they called them dwarfs with FS, maybe Games Workshop felt that they could defend their IP a little easier than if they called them dwarves with VES like Tolkien does. Maybe that was their way of being like, no, ours are different. Or maybe they just thought it sounded better. Also, according to various sources I have read and seen when just learning about Tolkien and his history and how he created his universe, apparently back in the day when Tolkien was writing The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and stuff, when he was writing about dwarves, his editors told him that it should be pronounced dwarfs, FS. But Tolkien hated that for whatever reason, and so just decided, no, I'm changing it, it's going to be VES. Which I just personally disagree with Tolkien. I prefer the FS. But maybe that's just because I'm biased with Warhammer Fantasy. But I don't, there's not really any well-known reason why Games Workshop decided to do it in the other way, because most fantasy universes nowadays, or even since Lord of the Rings, have preferred using Tolkien's iteration of the spelling, but I've always liked that Warhammer Fantasy does a different way. Next question. What real-world cultures are the Chaos Dwarfs based on? I am honestly not much of an authority on worldwide history. In fact, I would say I'm not even an authority on local history. It's just not really my scene. But it seems generally agreed upon in the Warhammer community that the Chaos Dwarfs themes, so like their design philosophy, not like their culture in the sense of like how they're evil and all that stuff, but just the way they look and the way, like, where they are in the world and all that stuff, they seem to be very heavily inspired by Babylonian or Mesopotamian culture, though they are not as in-depth inspired by those as some of the other factions are of their, relative kingdoms. For instance, they don't seem to have a character who's the equivalent of Gilgamesh or something like that, which is something you would think they would have based on where they are and who they're designed after and all that stuff. Next up, why are Chaos Dwarfs one of the least supported ranges by Games Workshop? And what might Creative Assembly do to expand their roster? Any chances of a unique legendary lord? So, this question, honestly, just the Chaos Dwarfs likely are not very heavily supported at this exact moment in time, because when they were around and they were available to purchase, people just weren't, most people, the larger community was not interested in supporting their range. People just didn't like them and didn't buy them. While many people on the internet seem very fond of the old ridiculous appearance with the stupid hats, it doesn't seem like the community at that time really liked the minis or the lore or anything like that, and they just fell out of favor. But it's impossible to say for sure unless, we have access to internal documents, but that is the most likely reason. I don't know why Games Workshop does the things they do. These are questions that I can speculate on as someone who's been a fan for a long time and listened to a lot of things about them, read a lot of things about them, but frankly, it's anyone's guess. Forge World did have a fairly successful campaign of bringing back the Chaos Dwarfs, as the range was surprisingly popular with Tarmacon, despite the absurd price tag. I mean, collecting the Chaos Dwarf minis from Tarmacon and making a playable army was very, very expensive. And it was also an all-resin range, which resin a lot of people don't like working with for understandable reasons. I don't like working with resin, or at least Forge World's resin. So, and on top of that, it was a very small army in that you had a very limited amount of options on how to build it. There weren't a lot of different types of units and stuff. And yet, despite all that, it was fairly popular. And it was, I would go to grand tournaments all the time, and you could very reliably bump into, if there were like 100 to 140 people participating, you could very reliably run into anywhere from like 2 to 10 Chaos Dwarf players, which is huge considering that range was essentially squatted. But as for how Creative Assembly will handle the situation, they'll probably just kind of clean up and reorganize a few things about the army. I don't know if we'll see a ton of new units. We've already had it confirmed 100% that Chaos Dwarfs are coming back in Age of Sigmar. They've already released new Hobgoblins in Age of Sigmar as part of the new 3rd edition core release. You can pick up, I think they're called Hobgrot Slitas now, and they are just, they're Hobgoblins, but they have grenades. So, I would suspect the Chaos Dwarfs will be popping out in 3rd edition and have a brand new range with a whole lot of stuff. So they clearly have survived their squatting and are surging back into popularity, and people seem to really like them, and I hope they have a successful re-release. In Total War Warhammer 3, I imagine they're going to just take the Tarmacon stuff and fill it out, but I imagine Tarmacon's going to be at the core of how they're designed and what they look like and where most of the units will be and all that stuff. There will almost certainly be a couple new units that pop up, but as there are many types of units that are described in Chaos Dwarf books, but were not necessarily playable, probably the most famous that I can think of off the top of my head that I would like to see, there's the Colossus, which granted the Kadai could be upgraded with a upgrade called Colossus. You could give a Kadai Destroyer the Colossus upgrade, which would make it massive and have all these additional bonus rules. So it could be that they will just interpret that the Colossus is another type of Kadai Destroyer, like it's a bigger version or maybe a Regiment of Renown. Personally, I would like to see it maybe made into its own thing, where the Colossus that I'm speaking of shows up in a couple different Black Library books and is mentioned in other books like Tarmacon, but the Colossus is usually described as this giant mechanical thing, like you can think of like almost like a giant mechanical spider or a giant mechanical statue, but it's this large steam-powered demon engine that has tons of Chaos Dwarfs running around on it that all like man gun stations or have guns. So they're constantly shooting people from it, and they've got like cannons. And so like if you've been around for the Dwarf Q&A or you've heard me talk about dwarves, and one of the DLCs I'd like to see them get is something called the Thunder Barge, which is like a giant war zeppelin that has organ guns and a whole bunch of other crap on it to just blow people away. The Chaos Dwarfs kind of have something similar to that, but it's on the ground, and it's more of like a melee-centric demon engine that also has Chaos Dwarfs crewing it, shooting people, instead of a giant flying machine that can like drop bombs and has organ guns and stuff like that. So I would love to see that. Another thing that is really funny that I've read about consistently, and actually I think they were mentioned in the 5th edition Chaos Dwarf book, the Tarmacon book. I don't think I've seen them mentioned in Black Libraries, but they've shown up in both of the so-called army books, and they are Chaos Dwarf infantry that have shoulder-mounted rocket launchers. So they're missile infantry with rocket launchers that they like kneel or prop up on their shoulders, and they fire like smaller versions of the Death Shrieker rockets, which Death Shrieker rockets are one of the war machines of the Chaos Dwarves, which are like a really scary version of a Hellstorm rocket battery. But there were apparently like a missile infantry version that was never made playable, but it sounds really fun. Also, I would not at all be surprised to see the Chaos Dwarfs acquire a few bonus monsters from the Monstrous Arcanum, particularly monsters that liked to hang around in the Darklands and were notorious for that and would fit the Chaos Dwarfs aesthetic, which the most likely, I think, would probably be the Magma Dragon, which the Magma Dragons are just obscene, and they're very evil, greedy, brutal creatures. In fact, the Chaos Dwarfs even actually created a Magma Dragon once, which we'll talk about another time. And then also the Dreadmaws. I think a Dreadmaw would be a perfect fit for a Chaos Dwarf army. Another thing is that in the Wulfric novel, There's mention of a elite halberd infantry unit known as the Immortals, which actually does make sense based on, where the Chaos Dwarfs are in the world and stuff. With Grimgor Ironhide having the history he does with the Chaos Dwarfs, I could totally see that it turns out that the way Grimgor got the idea for Immortals is that he met or knew of the actual Immortals being a very powerful elite halberd unit from the Chaos Dwarf Empire. That would actually be a really clever synergy there, I think. And also, someone actually mentioned this in the comment section in a prior video, which I will talk about at the end of, when we get to that episode I mentioned at the end of the series. But there is I think they're called Harridans, but there is a female Chaos Dwarf unit that are like women that are past childbearing age and stuff like that, that are kind of like an elite guard of some sort. I'd have to go back and read it, but I believe they also pop up in the Wulfric novel. The Wulfric novel, like whether those units could be considered like true canon or not, it's a toss-up. The book isn't about the Chaos Dwarfs, it just has like a notable set of chapters about the Chaos Dwarfs when Wulfric goes after killing one of them. But yeah, hopefully that answers that question sufficiently. I don't think there will be a unique legendary lord, though. I think the characters we talked about previously, I mentioned 5 characters. I think that's a plenty good lineup. Next up, how much do I personally enjoy the Chaos Dwarfs? Will they be the first campaign I'll play in Game 3? I really like the Chaos Dwarfs. I mean, I genuinely like every single Warhammer Fantasy faction. I could gush about any Warhammer Fantasy faction and play them and love them, and they are my sweetest babies. When it comes to the Chaos Dwarfs, I love the Kadai. The Kadai are one of my favorite designs. When it comes to demonic type stuff, I just really, really love the way they look, and the fact how they were created and stuff like that. I love the Kadai. And the concept of the Chaos Dwarfs essentially being mad scientists or sorcerers who stole a trick from the Old Ones book and essentially created their own life forms is hilariously badass, and I love and respect that so much about the Chaos Dwarfs. Plus, frankly, they have undeniably the sickest war machines in the in the Warhammer universe, as far as I'm concerned. Skaven, don't get me wrong, Skaven have cool war machines, but I just don't think they hold a candle to the pure, raw, destructive potential of the Chaos Dwarf war machines. But I mean, I'll definitely play them when their DLC drops. Like, are they my favorite faction that's been revealed for Game 3 so far? Honestly, that remains to be seen. I still need to see like how they do the Cathay roster and stuff like that. I think I would probably still do Nurgle before I would do Chaos Dwarfs, but I would definitely do Chaos Dwarfs before any of the other Dark Gods, and probably before Kislev. So, yep. Let's see here. Do I think that Chaos Dwarfs are superior to the Dawi, considering they're always evolving and creating incredible but terrible things, while the dwarfs are trapped due to their own conservative nature? What are my thoughts on this? That's a good question. I would personally say that they are equal but different. The Chaos Dwarfs have some serious damn problems when it comes to their itty-bitty population and scratching out a living in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The dwarfs do indeed evolve slower due to their traditionalist mindset, but at the same time, they have a far more ancient power to rely upon and many god-crafted relics to call upon in their defense. They also have allies, which accounts for a lot in the grand scheme of things, whereas the Chaos Dwarfs are so heinously cruel and arrogant that they hate everyone and see all other forms of life as a resource merely to be exploited, which, sometimes works in their favor. While the Chaos Dwarfs are undoubtedly one of the strongest races in the Warhammer world, pound for pound, so to speak, they are just a blip on the radar compared to most of the other world powers, and rely very heavily on their isolation to protect them, from being just absolutely smashed by those who deeply outnumber them. I think if the Dwarfs and the Chaos Dwarfs were to have an all-out war, the casualties would be horrific, but I just honestly can't imagine any possible scenario where the Dawi Czar managed to come out on top. They just don't have the numbers, and if they grew too weak, Tsar Nagrund would devour itself in slave revolts. Don't get me wrong, any kind of war between those two that was all out would inevitably cripple the Dwarfs to the extent that they would also just be a candle in the wind, but I think that they would claim victory in the end. The Chaos Dwarfs are a faction that have a very long view of the world. You know, they are... Most evil factions are not really the type to just, you know, conserve their power waiting for the proper moment. They kind of just attack when they're strong, and they come and go in waves. It's kind of like the general thing for evil races in Warhammer Fantasy. The Chaos Dwarfs are the one huge exception to that rule, where they never go out in a big wave. They're just constantly sitting there building and building and building and building. They're just stocking up power, stocking up might, and just waiting for that critical moment where they feel they're well positioned enough and the world is in the correct state for them to march out and just steamroll everybody. But they're just waiting until that proper moment. The awesome thing that I'm excited with Total War Warhammer is that we actually get to see that moment. You know, when the end times, unfortunately, when Tarmacon's The Throne of Chaos series got canceled, and Forge World was like basically told they're not allowed to work on fantasy anymore, and just a ton of projects got canceled, the Chaos Dwarfs never really got to build up after that. So when the end times happened, the Chaos Dwarfs were an afterthought that just didn't get to do anything. So we never got to see them throw open the gates of Tsar Nagrun because, you know, it's the end time, so they might as well stake their claim and all that. I'm really hoping in Age of Sigmar we're going to get to see them have that moment. And then the last question we have time for today, design question. Do I think the lore of Hashut will be its own thing? Yes, 100%, undeniably, without a fraction of a doubt. I don't think they're going to bother putting Chaos Dwarfs in Total War Warhammer 3 without the lore of Hashut. It will absolutely be part of the package. They will probably have, like, the lore of Hashut, the lore of Death, the lore of Fire. I think that's all they get. They might get Shadow or Metal as well, but they'll have a mix of those lores. But Hashut will be their big bad lore, and that's gonna be it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you tomorrow for some more Chaos Dwarf Q&A. So stay safe out there and love your faces. Oh wait, I've got to answer. A bonus question. We got time. We got time. Bonus question. Here we go. What kind of muffins do Chaos Dwarfs like? I would have to say, based on my research, that the flesh of a roasted Reiklander with just a tasteful sprinkle of elven blood makes for the best muffins. That's going to be it for me today. Catch you guys next time.